Hello friends, today we're going to create this image together in Photoshop, and I have all of the images and assets that I use today available in the description below. Now for this tutorial, I'm using two different services. The first one is 123rf.com, which is a stock photo website, and the second one is Envato Elements, which is where I'll be getting all the 3D rendering as well as some overlays for the edit today. Now one thing before we start, if you have an editing tablet, that's going to help you a lot, especially with some of the lighting effects that we'll be doing later on. But if you just have a regular mouse, that's no problem at all. The things that you're going to learn today are blending out images, removing fringing, dealing with 3D graphics, adding lighting effects, as well as using overlays to make your entire edit come together. There's a ton of great stuff that we're going to cover, so let's get started. So to start things off, let's create the overall environment of our scene, and for that we're using this archway as our main image, but then we need to change up the background, aka the sky, and then add some buildings in the back, as well as make this grass a little bit longer. We're going to do that with 3 different images. However, before we go and add those images, we need to cut out this sky, but luckily that's really easy since it's just white. Now you can use whatever method you like, but I'm going to use channels in this example. If you want to learn how to use channels more in depth, you can find a video up in the corner right now explaining the entire process more detailed. Anyways, I'm just going to add some levels adjustments here so I have tons of contrast. This will help us to make the selection around the edges of our castle or the archways. Hold Command or Control, click on the layer thumbnail or the channel layer thumbnail, and then add that to a layer mask. Press Command or Control I to invert that, and now we have removed that white sky. The beauty of channels is that it helps to select more complicated edges, such as any bricks or things like that. Usually does a better job than something like the quick selection tool when you have this much contrast. I'll drag and drop my sky photo into place like so, drag it behind my archway, and then grab my move tool by pressing V, and then I can just rescale this to fit where I would like for this particular scene. With my sky in position, I'm going to need to duplicate it just to add on an extension down here. So I'll press Command or Control J, and then with my move tool, once again, I'll move this down here like so. And then I'll add a layer mask, press Command or Control I to invert that. And now we're gonna just paint in this area to fill it in. So setting white to our foreground color, and then we will use a 0% hardness so we have a nice soft blend. I'm just gonna paint in this lower area like so until the harsh edge from the 2 images sitting together is gone. So with those both added, I'm gonna shift click both of them, press Command or Control G to group them, and I'll call this to sky. Grouping and organizing your layers is super important when you're working with projects like this. As you'll see later on, things start to get a little crazy. Now that we have our sky added, you'll see how we have this fringing, which is just some leftover color around the edge of our cutout. Luckily, we can get rid of that using Select and Mask. Double clicking on the archway layer mask, that will open Select and Mask. Within these settings, I'm just gonna bring up the smoothness slider, bring up the feather, bring up the contrast, and then bring in the edge like that. And then just to take care of any of the rest, just click on Decontaminate Colors, and that's going to get rid of all that for you. And once those adjustments are made, your selection is looking good. Just set it to Output to New Layer with Layer Mask and click OK. Now all of that fringing is gone and our cutout is looking a lot better. This has created a second version of our layer, but I'll just click on that original and press delete since we no longer need it. Now that we've added our sky and got rid of the fringing, let's go and add the castle at the end of this archway here. Dragging and dropping the background castle photo into place. I'll just grab my quick selection tool and then paint around the edge of the sky. It's going to create a selection of the sky for me. Then I will add that to a layer mask with the background castle layer selected. And with that layer mask selected, I'll press Command or Control I to invert it, and now we have just the castle selected. Now if I zoom in, you can see that there are some trouble areas here. Of course, it missed a few spots as you can see here, but luckily we can get rid of that really easy with the help of the Magic Wand tool. Clicking on the Magic Wand tool here, it's underneath the Quick Selection tool. Just click and hold to access those options. We can now go and set our tolerance to 30, make sure contiguous is unchecked, and then set our sample size to point sample since we're going really specific here. With our image layer thumbnail selected, just click on the color you want to get rid of. It's going to select all of that for us, and then we'll go and click on our layer mask, set our foreground color to black, and then we'll press Alt or Option and Delete to fill that area with black. Then we'll press Command or Control D to deselect it, and now we've gotten rid of most of that color. To refine this even more, we can go and use Select and Mask, just like before, double clicking on the layer mask. We'll then select the Refine Edge brush, and then just paint over the areas we want to fix up a little bit here that have a little bit of the sky still left over. Now that looks really good to me, but I'll just shift the edge in by a few percent here, and that just helps to take care of this fringing around the door. From there, we'll set our output to new layer with layer mask and click OK. Now we have our cutout all good to go, and we can delete our original version of that. Now I want this to sit underneath our archway, so of course I'll drag that layer back behind it, grab my move tool, and then place it down here like so. I actually want to flip this around, so I'll press Command or Control T, right click, and go to flip horizontal. And then now we can position this castle in the background like that. Now these trees are kind of in the way, so let's just get rid of them. So to do that, I'm actually going to grab the quick selection tool and make a fast selection just around the edge here. So going like so, with the arch layer selected. With your selection looking good, we need to fill this with black so then it removes it on the layer mask. So making sure that our layer mask is selected, that our foreground color is set to black, we'll press Alt or Option and delete. To fill that selection with black, press Command or Control D to deselect it, and now we have just our background castle in the background there. Now we have 3 of our photos added and in position. Now we just need to add some longer grass down in the foreground here. For that, I have my foreground grass layer. I'll drag and drop that into my photo. Make sure it's above all of my other layers. And what I want to do here is just select this grass and then use that down below. So I'll grab my marquee tool by pressing M, and then I'll just make a rectangular marquee selection around the grass like so. Now with this active selection made and our foreground grass layer selected, I'll press Command or Control J to add that selection onto its own layer. I'll delete the original image. Now with this new layer, I'll call it to grass, and we can position it over the lower part of our photo here. I'll hold the Shift key just to stretch it out a little bit, and then I'll press Command or Control T, right click and go to perspective, and then I'll just change the perspective of it, dragging down the upper corners and then dragging out the bottom corners just to make it look like it's at more of an angle and matches the view that we have with this camera. Then just make sure that all of the edges are covered as far as the foreground grass goes, and then we can press the check mark to commit to that. Now we obviously don't want this to fit everywhere, so I'll just add that to a layer mask, press Command or Control I to invert it, and now we're going to paint that grass back into position here. So grabbing my brush tool, making sure that white is set to my foreground color, that way we're adding to our black layer mask. The opacity and flow 100%, and I'm using just a soft round brush, hardness set to 0%, and we're going to just paint all along the grass where we want it to appear here. Now once you get to the edge of your grass, you don't want to go all the way to the pathway because obviously grass kind of has strands and stuff, so just a soft brush doesn't look very good. Luckily, there's a free grass brush that you can use to fix this problem. Now within your grass brushes, once you have them imported, again, you can get all of these down in the description below. I'm going to select the Tall Grass 4 brush. Now by default, this brush works pretty good, but I'm also going to go to my brush preset settings here, go to brush settings, and then in the shape dynamics option, I'm going to select the Flip X Jitter. So that's going to flip our brush back and forth randomly. Now I'll also go and increase the size jitter like so. So then all of our grass strands aren't exactly the same. With those settings in order, we can just scale down our brush, making sure that white is still set to our foreground color and our grass layer mask is selected. I will just go and begin to paint along the edge of our grass to add those nice strands in and blend it into the sidewalk or the path. Now that's looking pretty good, so let's just finish up the other side here. But of course our brush is backwards, so we'll just click on our brush settings and then go to our brush tip shape and then click on the flip Y axis. So that's going to flip our brush upside down, and then now we can continue to paint over on this other sidewalk that is in the other direction. Okay, so now we have our taller grass added in, and this is helpful because later on we'll have to deal with some of that with one of our knights that we are going to have laying in the grass. However, it is obviously way too bright for our image currently, so let's darken it up by adding an exposure adjustment layer, adding a clipping mask, and then just bringing down the exposure like so, just to match the background grass a little bit. And then we'll add a hue saturation adjustment layer, add a clipping mask once again, and then just adjust the master hue so we can add a little more yellow like the other grass in the background. Now let's quickly do some organization. I'm going to shift click all of my grass grass layers, press Command or Control G, but then I'm going to shift click all of my existing layers, press Command or Control G, and I'm going to call this to environment. Now before I go and add the other images into the photo, let's blend all of the colors and exposures of our existing layers. Starting with the background castle, I'm going to click on that layer and then add a curves adjustment layer, add a clipping mask, and then I'll just make some slight adjustments to add a bit of contrast to this brick wall. Then I'm going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer because this grass and the color of the walls do not match. So adding a clipping mask once again so it only affects that background castle. We'll first go to the red since that's probably what this castle wall will be in, and we can adjust that hue to match the yellow of the archways that you see here. Then as for the grass, we'll go and select the greens color channel, and we can adjust the grass to favor a more yellow color tone. Now lastly, within the master tab, I'll just bring down the saturation a touch just to make it a little bit less yellow, as that's what we're going to do with the other archways in just a moment. With that complete, we'll click on our archway layer, add a hue saturation adjustment layer, add a clipping mask so it only affects that one layer, and we can just go through the reds and the yellows to adjust the overall color of the walls. In this case, I pretty much just want to desaturate them. So bringing down the saturation of the reds, going to the yellows, bringing down the saturation of the yellows as well. And then I'll play around with the lightness to see what kind of adjustments we can get going here. Now I'm happy with the look of these walls for now. This just means I need to adjust the grass a little bit. So I'll go and touch up the exposure and hue saturation adjustments that we previously created. Now all that's left is our sky. And to adjust that, we will obviously go to our sky group. And then I'll add a curves adjustment layer. I will not add a clipping mask since it's at the very bottom of our layer stack, but I will go and add some nice contrast into here to make it a bit more moody. And then I'll also just add a hint of red to the midtones to match the overall vibe of the castle. Now we're ready to move on to our next step, which is adding in the dragon. Now the dragon that I'll be using today is from Envato Elements. It is a 3D rendering, and the really cool thing about it is you can choose the exact positioning and angle of the rendering all before you download the image, so that way you can fit it perfectly to your composition. Now I've already gone ahead and done that for this photo, so I'll just drag and drop that PNG image into the frame like so. Now once that's added, I'll convert this layer to a smart object, and then I'll grab my move tool by pressing V and scale this up and position it where I want in my frame. So I want this dragon to kind of be sitting relatively close to the front archways. Next, let's go and add our first knight to the foreground. With this knight photo here, we're going to select this guy on the left here, and I'll do that just by grabbing the quick selection tool and then painting over the knight that I want to select and continuing to do so until everything is selected on this knight. Now, while you're making adjustments of your quick selection, holding Alt or Option to subtract from your selection, or holding Command or Control to add to your selection is going to be a really helpful thing to know about when you are creating your quick selection. You could also use the pen tool in this case, but it's going to take you a lot longer, so I thought we'd use the easiest method. Now with our selection created, we'll add that to a layer mask like so, and then we'll just have to do a little bit of touching up here, especially in the sword. So grabbing my brush tool, clicking on the layer mask, I'll set my brush hardness to something like 80 to 90% there. So I'll just click once down near the edge of my sword, and then hold the Shift key and click up higher to extend the edge of our sword a little bit. Now as for areas that you need to remove, you can just set your foreground color to black, and then you can simply mask out those areas just by painting over anything you want to remove. This is where an editing tablet becomes very useful, because you can use pen pressure to simulate the exact edges that you're wanting to create, and that way you're not scaling the brush as frequently. You can just press harder or lighter on your tablet. Now if you want to see how these tablets actually work, I'll leave a video up in the corner right now sharing all of those details. So again, for all of these adjustments, I'm just painting black or white to add or subtract to my layer mask to refine the edge of the sword and any missed areas of my subject. Once everything looks pretty good, we can touch things up a bit more using select and mask. So double clicking on your layer mask, grabbing the refine edge brush tool, we can go and paint over any problem areas such as down there. And then we can go and adjust the smoothing just a touch. increase the feather, increase the contrast to make everything sharp once again, and then just bring down the edge just a little bit so that we have no fringing left over. We'll then set our output to new layer with layer mask, click OK, and then now we'll delete our original layer. Now with that all cut out and ready to go, we'll grab our move tool and just position this over where we would like within our photo. I need him to look like he's about to attack this dragon, so that will work for now. Then I'll just move my dragon over a little bit so we can see his face. Our next subject is a knight lying on the ground. This guy has been slain already. So this photo right here is why we added some longer grass in, because this way the long grass around his body will make some sense, because if he was laying on a nice manicured lawn, that would not make sense. Now to select this guy right here, I'm going to select the quick selection tool, then go and click on the select subject button. This will automatically create a selection around this guy for me so I don't have to do all the work. With that selection made, I'll add that to a layer mask, and now we can go and position him using the move tool down on the ground over here. Now to help blend him into the ground a little bit more, we're going to use our grass brushes once again. So going to the brush presets and then finding our grass brushes. Let's select the tall grass 2 brush and just rescale this to a nice small size to fit within the size of our subject. With that layer mask selected and black set to our foreground color, we're just going to go and paint along the edge of our subject to blend in any of the grass that's around him. You can use a larger brush if needed, and this will just mask out part of our subject but then reveal the grass underneath in the shape of more grass. With all of our grass brushes added to blend him into the ground, let's add a hue saturation adjustment layer, add a clipping mask. Then I'm going to go and choose one of the yellows and increase the saturation. As you can see, it's affecting everything right now, but I want to mostly affect the color of the grass that's left around him. So I'll click on the eyedropper tool, go and click on that color to create a new custom color range. And then now we can bring down the saturation of that and darken it down a little bit as well. And this will not only blend in the grass that is left over, but it will also blend in the colors of our subject into the scene a little bit better. Next, we'll add a exposure adjustment layer, add a clipping mask once again, and just darken down our entire subject at once. But then we don't want it to affect his entire body because we still need this upper area to be brighter. So I'll grab my brush tool and choose a soft round brush, and then painting black, and I'll set my opacity to 30%. This will just allow us to paint some highlights back into part of our subject. And in this case, it's just the upper half of his body. Okay, so now with those adjustments, turning that on and off, you can see how much better that blends into our scene just with a couple of adjustment layers. I'll shift click both of those, press Command or Control G to group them, and I'll call this to Ground Knight. Now from here, you might notice that the dragon is a little bit blurry, so let's add some sharpness to it. So clicking on our dragon layer, press Command or Control J, and then we'll go to Filter, Other, and High Pass. We'll set the radius to around 5 pixels, click OK, and then we'll set the layer blending mode to hard light. This is going to add a ton of sharpness to our entire photo and make things look a little bit better. Of course, this is too much sharpness, so I'll add a layer mask and then grab my brush tool, painting black with a 100% opacity. I'm just gonna go and remove some of the sharpness from areas that I don't really care about, aka the dragon's legs and some of the wings on the back side here. Now the last subject that we're gonna add into this photo is another dragon flying up high, so it looks like the castle is being under attack by the dragons. Going to my other dragon, once again I got this from Envato Elements. I'll just drag and drop this over into my project, and then I'll place it below all of my other subjects. I'll then go and place it up in the sky using the move tool, and it just is going to be a background dragon to give a little bit more atmosphere to our photo. Now with that dragon in position right around there, I'll add an exposure adjustment layer, add a clipping mask, and then darken that down so that it's more of a silhouette up in the sky. We might have to do some more touching up to that later on, but for now, that looks good enough for me. Now that all of our subjects are placed, let's go and do some organization once again. For my dragon, I'll just shift click both of those layers, press Command or Control G, and call this to Dragon. I'll then go to my other flying dragon, shift click those, do the same thing once again, and call this to Flying Dragon. And then as for my knight, I will just add it to a group, and then I'll call this to standing night, as we're going to be adding a lot more layers to this adjustment later on, so it'll be helpful to have it in a group. Now let's go and add our fireball coming out from the dragon's mouth. Once again, I got all of these fire assets from Envato Elements. This is a 3D rendering, and then the overlays that we'll use later are just a image pack. All of the links to access these exact files are down below. Clicking and dragging the fireball layer over, I'm going to go and position this right in front of my dragon's mouth. I'll then hold the shift key just to stretch this out a little bit, and then maybe stretch it downwards a touch as well. Of course, we want this to be sitting behind our standing knight, so I'll go and move this underneath the standing knight layer like that. I'll then press Command or Control J to duplicate that fireball layer, grab my move tool, and then make this one significantly smaller, hold the shift key to stretch it out, and then I'm going to position this over inside of the dragon's mouth so that it looks like it's coming from the back of its throat. I'll then add a layer mask to that fireball copy, which is the small one here. And then with black set to my foreground color, 100% opacity with a soft brush, we are going to just mask the harsh edges there so it blends into the other fireball a little bit better. Now I'll shift click both those layers, call this to fireball, and then we'll add a curves adjustment layer, add a clipping mask, and then let's just add a touch of contrast into this fireball. Looks a little more mean now. And then we'll add a hue saturation adjustment layer, add a clipping mask, and then within the master tab, we'll just play around with this to make it a little bit more red. So now all of the elements are added to our photo, so let's move on to the next phase of our edit, which is lighting effects. Lighting effects are going to be adding any highlights around all of our subjects, and in this case we'll have to add some fire highlights, we'll have to add some sky glow highlights around the wings and such, and then we will have to add some general glow adjustments to the overall archway, because imagine there's a big fireball being lit, it's going to have some red hues there. So let's start things off by adding some fire adjustments to our dragon. Clicking on my dragon group, I'm going to open that up, and within this dragon group I'll click on my dragon layer, not the sharpening layer, which I'll just rename right now. We want to click on the dragon layer itself and then add a hue saturation adjustment layer. Add a clipping mask so it will only affect our dragon, and we'll click on colorize. This will add a single color hue to the entire dragon. Now what we want to do here is add a bluish highlight, bluish white highlight, as if it is being lit from the sky behind it. So I'll adjust the hue to be a nice teal color there, or cyan color, bring up the saturation, and then I'll bring up the lightness. Actually, since I want this to be a bit more white, I'm going to bring up the lightness even more and then bring down the saturation. I still want a hint of blue color, but now it's mostly white here. From there, we'll double click on the hue saturation adjustment layer, and we're going to use blend if to blend these adjustments into our photo a little more naturally. With our blend if set to gray and the underlying layer selected, I'll just hold the Alt or Option key, click that shadow point, that'll break it apart and add a feather, and then we'll drag this up until that adjustment blends into our dragon a bit better. You can also bring up the base point if you wish to further affect which shadows are excluded from your highlight adjustment. Clicking OK there, we can now click on that layer mask, press Command or Control I to invert it, and then we'll grab our brush tool. Now within our brush settings, I'll make sure the soft round brush is selected, and I'll set the hardness to a low amount, in this case around 10%, and then I'll just squish the brush a little bit like so. I'll then go and begin to paint white over the edge of my dragon's wings here, where the highlight would be as if it was being lit from the background. That means you probably wouldn't add a light over here, you're only going to be adding it sort of in this general area that I am right now. Now adding these highlights can be a little bit time consuming, as you do have to go through and manually paint everything in where a highlight would naturally be. What I like to go do is add a general highlight to all the areas that I need to add it to, and then I'll go back and subtract from that using the layer mask, so just painting black onto that mask instead of white to remove those highlight adjustments. After a little bit of playing around, you'll end up with a really nice result of your highlight that looks realistic and nicely blended to match the light source in your image. So now that I have the color of my highlight added to the dragon, I'm going to duplicate this hue saturation adjustment layer, and then I'm going to go and clear the layer style, which in this case is the blend if options. From there, I'll click on the layer mask and I'll press Alt or Option and delete with black set to my foreground color to make that layer completely invisible once again. I'll then add a clipping mask to that adjustment so it's only affecting my dragon. I'll then continue to use my brush tool, and I'll set my brush hardness to 0% if it isn't already, and then I'll set my opacity to 50% or something around there. I'll then go and paint over any of the edges that I want to add a little more lighting too. This will just add a bit more color and kind of like it's spilling off a bit more. To make it even more subtle, you can bring down the opacity. I'll set it to 10% just to add some even slighter lighting effects around my dragon. Now with the blue highlight complete, let's do the same process, but this time with an orange highlight for the fire. Adding a hue saturation adjustment layer, once again, I'm gonna click on colorize, add a clipping mask, and then I'll choose a nice orange color to match the fire coming out of the dragon's mouth. With that layer mask selected, I'll press Command or Control I to invert it, and then we can go and repeat the same process as before. With our dragon highlights created, look at how big of a difference that makes just to give it a more realistic feel in terms of our scene. However, it does feel like our overall photo is a bit too bright, so let's darken that down first, and then we'll go through all of our other subjects using the exact same steps as our dragon to light them according to the sky and from this fireball. So to darken up my image, I'll go to the environment group, open that up, and then I want to darken everything from the grass to the archway, but I do not want to affect the sky. So I'm going to select everything except for the sky, create a new group pressing Command or Control G, call this to building, and then I'll add a curves adjustment layer and then darken down the overall brightness of this area. Now to make the dragon a little bit brighter, I'll create a new exposure adjustment layer above my fireball group. I will not add a clipping mask, but I'll just increase the brightness like so. And from there, I'll press Command and Control I to invert that, grab my gradient tool by pressing G. Using a foreground, a transparent gradient, and a radial gradient, I'll make sure that my gradient is set to white by setting my foreground color to white, and then I'll click and drag out to just brighten around the dragon itself. Now let's go and do the lighting effects to the knight on the ground as well as the knight standing up front, because they need to have some fire light on them at this point. Like I said before, using the exact same methods as we did with the dragon, this is going to take me a little bit to do all of our subjects, so roll the montage. So now all of our lighting effects are complete, and that definitely did take me a little while. So you're welcome. You didn't have to sit through that 45 minutes or whatever that was. Now we have our lighting effects and we're ready to do our global adjustments, and basically just make our scene blend together a little bit better. So rather than dealing with all of our individual layers anymore, we can start doing things in broader strokes. The first thing that I want to do is add a general vignette to our photo. And to do that, we'll just click on our topmost layer, add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer, then bring down the brightness like so. I'll then grab my gradient tool, make sure my foreground to transparent gradient is selected. I'll choose a radial gradient and then make sure my foreground color is set to black. I'll then click in the middle and drag out to brighten only that center area that I'm creating the gradient in. I'll then grab my brush tool and then I'll paint over the other areas I would like to have brighter in the photo. And if you're unsure about exactly what's being affected, you can just look at your layer mask here. Anything that is black will have the darkening adjustments hidden. So turning that on and off, it just darkens up our photo a little bit more. Then the next thing I'd like to do is add some more shadows to the edges of my dragon's wings, as well as on the ground in front of our fallen knight. So to keep things organized, let's just do that within each group. So going to the dragon group, then adding a exposure adjustment layer, darkening that up, adding a clipping mask, and then I'll press Command or Control I to invert that mask, grab my brush tool, painting white. I'm just going to darken the edge of its wings like so. Might even bring that down a little bit more to add a bit more darkening. I'll then use a 30% opacity brush and just extend that darkening down the wings of the dragon. Now for the other darkening adjustment, I'll go to the ground knight group, add an exposure adjustment layer, darken that up a little bit, and then press Command or Control I once again, same as before, using white with a soft brush. I can just go and paint in front of this fallen soldier like so, just to darken that area up. And then to make life easy after you've created that mask, you can just adjust the exposure slider as needed. And then to make that further blend in, I'll just do a bit of blend if and bring up the shadows a touch like that. Now I want to add a bit of a red hue to the center of the image, and we can do that with a color balance adjustment layer. I'll create this layer above the fireball but below the knights. So creating that color balance adjustment layer, I'll then add some yellow and then add some red. Then I'll press Command or Control I, grab my gradient tool, and once again using a white gradient foreground to transparent, I'll click and drag out just to this time add that color into the area rather than the exposure. So this time we now have that nice red color around the entire dragon. With that complete, I want to make the sky look a little bit more glowy. So I'll add a new layer up there and then choose a nice bluish color, nice cyan here. And then with my brush tool selected, I'll just click and drag out and create a large brush of blue. Then I'll choose a slightly lighter color, click inside of the original, choose a lighter color once again, bring down the brush size and click inside the original again. Now set the blending mode from normal down here to overlay, and I'll drag this layer down to my sky. So in the environment group and then into my sky. Now using my move tool, I'll just reposition this and scale it to fit within the open area of the clouds, and this will kind of give it a glowy look. With the blending mode set to linear dodge add and then bringing down the fill, you can kind of add a cool glow look to the sky pretty easily. I'll then use some blend if adjustments to further blend in this highlight. This way it doesn't seem overpowering and wash out the dark areas of the clouds, but it's still visible. Turning that on and off, you can see the nice difference that adds. Now let's go and do our global adjustments to just finalize the exposure and color of the edit, and then we're gonna go and add some awesome spark overlays in just a minute. But first, let's do some general exposure adjustments. I'll add a curves adjustment layer, add a bit of contrast to this photo, spice things up a little bit, maybe play around with the color range options as well. I'll then add a hue saturation adjustment layer, and we'll go through each of the color channels individually and do a general hue adjustment for every single hue at once. Now I'll add a color balance adjustment layer and apply the image by going to Image, Apply Image, and this just helps those colors blend into our photo a bit better by using a layer mask, so then the darks and the highlights are affected differently by our color adjustments. I'll then work through the midtones, shadows, and highlights of the midtones to see what kind of effects I can get. So then just turning those three adjustments on and off, you can see the big difference that helps to create. Now let's go and add our overlays and finish with some dodge and burning. I'll first add this overlay to add some sparks around the dragon's fiery breath. So I'll make sure that this is behind the standing knight, of course. And then I'll position this down around here. And then using the move tool, I can just squeeze this into position so that it only is fitting around the fireball. I'll then just add a layer mask and mask out any areas around the fallen knight because it looks weird if there's sparks coming behind him since he's laying down. I'll then add a fire down in the corner of the image, setting the blending mode to screen. Then I'll go and position this down over here, scale it down so it's just a little tiny flame hanging out in the corner there. But for this layer, I'm going to position it at the very top so it's not affected by any of our global adjustments, and that way it will be nice and bright. So just a little hint of flame like that will work for me. And then I'll add another spark overlay to enhance that fire a little bit more, setting that blend mode to screen, positioning that down by the fire over there. And then just creating a new layer, grabbing the brush tool, holding Alt or Option to sample that orange color. I'm just gonna paint a little bit of glow down here like that. Set the blending mode to overlay, change the fill a little bit so that it blends a touch better. And then I might try the same thing with a lighter color once again. Now lastly, I'll add one more spark overlay. This one's gonna cover the entire photo, so drag and drop that onto there, set the blending mode to screen once again, and then I will just scale and position these sparks to fit basically everywhere in the frame. And then I'll add a layer mask, grab my brush tool, and then just mask out any areas that are covering my standing knight. I'll do the same thing with this other overlay right there. Now I'll shift click all of those layers, press Command or Control G and call this to sparks. Turning that on and off, you can see how it just adds a nice touch to the overall environment of our photo. Now, the last thing that we need to do to tie everything together is to dodge and burn, and I'm gonna do that using two different curves adjustment layers. I'll create one curves adjustment layer and I'll call this to brighten, aka dodge, and then I'll create another one and I'll call this to darken, aka burn. Starting with the brighten layer, I'm going to click in the midtones and drag up to brighten the overall photo. I'll then press Command or Control I to invert that mask. And now using a white brush, I'm just going to paint around the areas that I want to brighten in my photo. This can be anything you want. And of course you can use the opacity to change how noticeable these brightening adjustments become. So I'm just going to quickly go and paint around everywhere in my photo that I would like to brighten. I'm going to be using a variety of opacities, but the easiest way to switch between them is by pressing 1 through 0 on your keyboard. This way you don't have to go and adjust it up here. Next, I'm going to do the same process with the darkening. This time I'm dragging down the midtones to darken, and then I'll press Command or Control I to invert that mask. Now painting with white, we're going to darken our photo wherever we paint. And with that, we now have completed our edit. And man, that was a lot of stuff that we just did, but this is a pretty sweet result. We got to use so many different types of images. We got to use regular photos, graphic overlays, as well as some 3D renderings, all with the help of Envato Elements and 123rf.com. If you followed along with this tutorial, I would love to see how it turned out, so make sure to tag me on Instagram when you upload it so I can check it out and show you some love. Now, if you're still hanging around at this point in the video, then you must love photo manipulations, which is what I love to talk about on this channel. So of course, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and leave a little like down below to help support the algorithm gods.